Hey folks, Dave Acosta here with Achilles Heel Tactical, another YouTube video. This evening we're going to cover some content in regards to home defense strategies. We generally talk about this stuff when we do our active shooter, active threat, home defense classes. But in those classes it's generally geared towards more of the defensive side of it, right? Like when I mean defense, I obviously mean offense, using tools and using specific tactics, techniques, and procedures that allow us to transfer energy to a target. In the class, we generally will discuss strategies, principles, concepts relative to home defense as far as what takes place and should take place, as far as thought, and then specific strategies in relation to that prior to actually going to the point where we need to transfer energy to a target. But this evening, I figured we'd stop and talk about everything that kind of leads up to that. I'm a firm believer that if we do our due diligence in taking the time to develop a good system in relation to all the things that take place to home defense strategies prior to just thinking about tools and the actual fighting component, we can do a good job of eliminating the vast majority of times that it would be possible, right? So we're trying to use this with the intent of creating a clear line that delineates between an accident or somebody knocking on the door to an actual home invasion type of scenario. So anyway, with that being said, we're going to go through, work through some stuff. If you have questions, feel free to comment below and we'll try to tackle those in the comment section if possible. This is not going to be a deep dive. It's going to be more of an overview. I'm going to break it down into several categories under what I call home defense strategies. And I'm going to be using this whiteboard behind me to help me help you. So, in home defense strategies, I break it down kind of the same way we do in classes when we start talking about physical security. We're just going to break it down, from personal security perspective, and we're just going to break it down to a physical security perspective in relation to guarding a home, guarding a business, guarding a structure in specifically. For the context of this video, we'll talk about the home. So the way I like to break this down is to several categories. All of these categories overlap, and we'll see how that kind of falls into play in the end. But these first 5 categories that we're going to discuss really do help and aid in the prevention of a home invasion kind of scenario, and allows us to create a very clear, distinct picture in our mind of what's taking place if somebody actually gets into the house. A lot of times when I see content that surrounds like the idea of home defense, is generally centered around the idea of tools on the nightstand, and then where do I go and how do I get there? How do we move while armed through a structure kind of thing? I think if we do again, like I said, our due diligence on the front end of this scenario to do all that we can to prevent it from happening, we're less likely to have to deal with that last circle, if you will. All right. So when I draw this out, just for the purpose of like demonstration, the way I'm thinking about it is kind of like this, right? Like that inner closest most circle, that's like the actual defending portion, right? Like, hey, like I now need to grab tools, go to a strong point inside the house, right, that I can defend easily and have a specific point of domination, if you will, right? Outside of that are several other rings that we kind of use as like tripwires that help us distinguish between, a committed or formidable individual whose intent is what we would imagine it would be, right? So kind of like when we talk about fighting, it's important to find what that fight actually looks like. We have to ask several questions. So what's the most probable course of opposition action, right? So these dudes or dude that's going to break into your house and do bad things to you or your family, like who are they, right? How many are they? What tools are they going to bring to bear? What skill level are they? How committed are they? All these things are questions we need to take into consideration when we're building out this plan or this strategy. So first thing I'm going to talk about, in all honesty, is just going to be on the deterring side. So the first thing I want to do is think about how can I deter something bad from happening, right? So we want to make our structure from the exterior be a hard target, right? And some people will think about just the actual structure itself. They won't take into consideration like the idea of proximity in relation to thinking further outside that bubble, if you will. So if I want to deter bad stuff from happening, first and foremost, like ideally, I'm selecting a location as far as where I live or where I'm conducting my business that's going to be lower crime, right? So obviously, you're not going to watch this video and then instantaneously move unless you needed to, and you could. But what we generally see is with security comes two things. The factor of cost, right? And the factor of inconvenience. So we have to take those things into consideration and look at first and foremost. So let's start from the perspective of having good situational awareness and understanding where do I even live, right? If we think about it this way, where do you live in the country, right? Northeast, southeast, south central, etc. What state, right? Not just what state, but what town, what city, right? What neighborhood, what street, where on the street, what specific, is it a cul-de-sac? Is it the middle of the street? Where's your house actually located on the street? And then we take into consideration the actual house itself. How much property do you have? How much property do you not have? All these things come into consideration with creating and understanding the likelihood of something bad happening. So first and foremost, we want to be thinking about our area, right? And when we think about the area, we start all the way out to regionally within the country, the state, then the city, etc., like we said earlier. So what area do you reside in? Is it a high crime area? Is it a low crime area? Who are you, right? Like, why would somebody do a home invasion at your specific house? Was it because you're a high-profile individual, or you have assets that somebody wants to obtain and take by force? Is it one of those things where it's just a mistake of identity? They thought your house was somebody else's, so random act of violence in that regard. These are things that we're looking at. So everything we say on the deterrent side will be things that we take into consideration as far as what we should be thinking about prior to help deter something bad from happening. And just selecting the right location can help play in that, right? By decreasing the likelihood of bad stuff happening there. After the area, right, we start getting into things. When you think deter, think of things that create a hard target. So what we want is to create a hard target for the opposition, right? And what I mean by that is, if it's my house on the street, I want the would-be intruders to look at my house, the house next to it, and the house next to it on the other side, and look at it and be like, yep, that house in the middle, that juice isn't worth the squeeze. That's going to be too hard to get into. So I'd rather pick that house or that house, right? Like, I want them to look at the house from the outside, and I want it to be an instant deterrent, right? So what are things that we can do that help us make our house or our property, whatever it is, appear to be more of a hard target, all right? So first and foremost, we want to look at the perimeter. So the perimeter in relation to how easily can someone get onto your actual property. So what are things that we can do that automatically off the rip, right, from the beginning, the onset of the scenario, when somebody cases the joint, looks at the house, does an assessment, they look at it and they're like, yep, that's just going to be too difficult. It's going to take too much time. By the time we get to the door, the dog's barking, the alarms are going off, the motion sensors are going crazy, et cetera, et cetera. So first thing we want to think about is perimeter. Let's start on the furthest most ring. So think about our property line. I'm a huge fan of fencing, right, in any way, shape, or form. Think about like the castle, right? The castle with the moat around it, right? Like that acts as a barrier that makes it an order of magnitude greater to, be able to access. Okay, I've got to get past the moat. Think about the castle walls, right? These walls, they're 30 feet tall. We're gonna have to scale these walls. It's just gonna take too much time. I don't have the right equipment, et cetera, et cetera. Now, obviously, we don't live in a castle. Although there are people that do, I'm not one of those dudes. So if we look at the common man, common American, that's just generally not a thing. So what can we do on the perimeter? Can we do a fence, right? Like ideally, I'd rather have a rock wall. What's at the top of the rock wall that makes it not so easy to get over, to scale, right? When we think of hard structures like fencing, walls, there's two types, right? There's types that its height and its makeup prevent onlookers from looking into the house and seeing the property. That already obscures their vision. which acts as a way of deterring their ability to assess whether or not they can actually get into the home itself, right? If the view of your home is obscured by whether it's natural vegetation, trees, how far out it is from the actual road, etc., all those things act as deterrents, right? Think about it this way. Which is the best safe to own? The best safe to own, I would argue, is the one that nobody knows exists, right? So it's hard to break into a safe that you don't know exists. So I'm trying to do that with the house if all possible. If the house is set back and there's natural vegetation that prevents anybody outside looking in from seeing the house, that's a huge bonus. That may not be practical for everyone, so maybe we deal with putting up a fence, right? Short fences are obviously easy to get over. Taller fences, a little bit more difficult to get over. Not impossible, it's easy to be driven through, etc. Again, it comes down to what is the commitment or the intent of your opposition. So when we think about perimeter, if you go towards fencing, you have to think about, does the fence obscure your ability to see out of the house, right? That can work against you, and I don't like the idea of impeding my own ability to see the landscape, if you will, right? I want to be able to see intruders from as far away as I possibly can. That buys me time by having that extra space. So, perimeter stuff, right, with the intent of deterring. Having signage is a huge thing, right? So, fencing and barriers. That's one thing. Signage. Now, I've seen several types of signage, right? Like this home protected by Smith & Wesson, etc., right? Like, hey, we don't call 911. There's all types of signs. I think something as simple and as professional as saying this home is protected by X security company goes a long way, right? Even if you don't actually have that, it's good to have the signage there. Beware of dog. Little things like that go further than you would actually think in the eyes of somebody that's potentially staking the house, right? Does your neighbor have it? If they don't, it's like, okay, I will go to that house as opposed to that one. Let's push them off to the next one if all possible. When we think about fences, barriers, signage, something as far as signage could be, hey, neighborhood watch. And that extends beyond the perimeter of your home specifically, but goes into the neighborhood. That could be faked, obviously, just with signage, but the reality is, like, if we have a local Facebook group or a way of communicating on some type of chatting channel for either through social media or just through a text string of some sort, where all the neighbors on that specific block or area have an open conversation on a regular basis about security needs and things of that nature, that helps. Hey, suspicious vehicle in the area, just saw this car parked in front of my house. Most times, right, like 9 times out of 10, it's just an Uber driver that's lost or an Amazon driving their personal vehicle to go deliver stuff. Nonetheless, that communication is good for everyone. It's also creates an atmosphere where the neighbors are also looking in and paying attention to each other's property. Do you know your neighbors? Do you trust them? Do you have that community rapport where you've established lines of communication and degrees of trust so that you're all working together as a small community? Back to the perimeter, fencing, barriers, obviously that helps. Fencing and barriers, that could be a myriad of things like we said. That could be stone barriers, stone, concrete, things of that nature. It could be wrought iron, right? Steel, that's better. Wood, okay, not great. If you do, make sure that the wood, if all possible, is built in a way where the lateral bars that make it easy to climb over are on the interior of the property and not on the exterior of the property. Making sure, even if it's just vegetation, whether it's trees or bushes, things of that nature, what are the types of vegetation that will limit their ability to see in, so privacy screening kind of thing, in relation to bushes that have natural thorns and prickers, things like that, where it makes it a little more difficult to get across, right? So signage, when we talk about the signage, we're referencing things that clearly denote that the property is watched, it's guarded, either a security system or canines, a dog, something of that nature. If you have an actual dog, right, that acts as a form of signage and that it clearly communicates, like we have some type of early detection alarm. When we talk about other things that make it visible on the perimeter, you can get into cameras, right? So these cameras I want to be visible, right? Lighting that goes along with them, these kind of things work in tandem. Again, I want that to be visible. And the reason I want that to be visible is specifically because I want it to act as a form of deterrence, right? It will fall into the category of detection, but at face value, if I can get those cameras and that lighting to act in a way that it deters something bad from happening, then that's a good thing, right? So there's aspects of cameras and lighting that I want to do intentionally that is visible from the property line of an onlooker that sees it and says, yep, this juice isn't worth the squeeze. They've got cameras everywhere, they've got lighting everywhere, they've got dogs in the yard, signs saying that they have dogs, signs saying that they have security systems, the fencing is there, there's visual barriers, physical barriers. It's going to take me time to get onto the property. If it doesn't cost me a lot of time, I'm not going to be able to do it surreptitiously. I'm not going to be able to get onto that property easily without being seen, observed by either the individuals residing in that home or specifically neighbors, okay? So those are things that I think work really well in regards to just flat out being a deterrent. The other thing is just maintenance, right? When we look at it specifically, things that we need to take in consideration with the house is maintenance. And when we look at maintenance, the idea of maintenance is simply this, right? If I pull up to a house and the front screen door is hanging off the hinges, the screen is torn, the yard hasn't, the grass hasn't been cut in months, the mailbox is full, things like that give me the notion or the idea that the house isn't well maintained, that maybe somebody's not there, maybe somebody's not actively living there, or the people that do live there don't care, right? So just it becomes a way of kind of getting an idea as to who resides there, right? When I pull up to a house where I have all these things and then it's well maintained, the lawn is well manicured, right? The mailbox is empty. They're paying attention to detail with all these little things. It tells me that the individuals that reside there, as well as in that neighborhood, are paying a little more attention to those things. They're more aware of their surroundings and they care about those things, right? So on the maintenance side, I want to make sure that all that can be buttoned up is buttoned up well, is nice, presentable, and tells an onlooker or someone that was staging the house that it is being actively paid attention to and actively cared for, maintained on a regular basis. Whether that's by the homeowners or if that's subbed out to contractors, whatever. It's an important thing that I think is often overlooked. Other thing on the deter side, obviously we mentioned dogs. This will become kind of redundant. Dogs on the property, right? And it's not something that can't be defeated. The dogs don't even need to actually be biting dogs or working dogs in that capacity. But if the dogs just do a good job of making a lot of noise when they see new people in the area, that helps act as an early detection device, all right? Where it's like, okay, well, they have dogs. If I get close to the fence, if I pull up in front of the house, if I walk onto the sidewalk, that dog immediately runs to the fence line and starts barking, starts yapping, which tells everyone like, hey, there's somebody here, whether it's the neighbors or the actual homeowners themselves. Moving away from that, we're going to get into the detection, right? So detect. I'm actively putting things in place, right, that are going to assist me in detecting when something bad may be happening. So when we look at that, obviously there's aspects of this that carry over, okay? Specifically, obviously, the dogs carry over. All right, from a detection perspective, now we start getting into alarms, right? Like think tripwires. Before the dude gets into the house or the dude and his buddies get into the house, I want him to have to go through several tripwires, right, throughout that space between the street and my house that act as a way of me knowing that they're there, right? So now I know how far they are onto the property by the different forms of detection, right? So one of the things you could do are, they have these in driveways all the time, and they're these little IR lasers that basically when that IR beam is tripped, what happens is there's an audible sound which can be outside the property as well as inside the property. I maybe get a notification on my phone, front driveway, right? And I can label those things and have several of them as redundancies based on different proximities, right? So if my driveway was 50 yards, I have one at the 50-yard line, one at the 25-yard line, and one closer to where the garage door is. So when I start hearing those different dings, I know how close the person is based on how fast those dings took place or how fast those alarms are kind of tripped, if you will. Gives me an idea as to whether or not the individual drove, rode a bike, or walked on foot, or potentially ran onto the property. So things like that. Lighting, right? The lighting aspect carries over. When we think about lighting, most people think about just lighting up the house itself. If we had a bird's eye view, I'll erase this after, but let's just say this was a bird's eye view of the house. And this is obviously not drawn to scale. But most people think about putting lighting around the house itself, right? But the reality is what I'd like to do is not just have lighting this way. If I can get lighting on that fence line that goes back toward the house itself and illuminates it from this direction, it's just more difficult for an individual to, again, gain access to the property without being in one of those lights. Obviously, where any of those lights are, there can also be cameras. With today's cameras nowadays, most of the cameras nowadays with our modern tech have the ability to see in the dark, to see color in the dark, right? It'll add that into it. And those cameras can be at different locations, different positions as far as height for different purposes. I like the idea of having cameras higher and lighting higher specifically so that they're not easily swatted with a bat or a broom, something along those lines. I like having lighting and cameras that are obviously visible on the deterring side, and then those that are actually not visible. So the visible lights and the visible cameras are visible from to an intruder on the outside looking in. However, it's nice to also have redundancies of having lighting and cameras or IR detection devices that act as tripwires to let me know that somebody's on property that they can't necessarily see. If they can see them, if they can reach them, they can potentially hit them, defeat them, things like that, knock them off, and interfere with them in that regard. So if we have a combination of both visible and non-visible, right? Not invisible, but non-visible. If we have both of those, right? It just acts again as a redundancy and allows us better coverage of the property as a whole, okay? So again, on the cameras and lighting side, I want both sides. From the outside looking in toward the house, as well as from the outside of the house, or looking outward towards the property line. When we talk about levels, I like having cameras that are, again, higher as well as around eye level. And the reason for that is one is for one purpose, the other is for another. So, again, not drawn to scale, but let's just say this is a house. Let's imagine that for a second. Garage doors, whatever, front door, blah, blah, blah. Second floor windows, blah, blah, blah. Right? I like having cameras high. Those cameras high give you a better kind of bird's eye view, if you will. Where lower facing cameras, let's say this is the front door, these are the garage doors, right? Excuse my drawing. If that's the case, having lower cameras, those lower cameras we want to be a little more discreet in nature, right? And those cameras are at eye level with the intent of identifying faces, right? I'd rather those cameras not be as visible or as apparent, as obvious as the cameras that are higher up, right? The higher up cameras are harder to strike or defeat. They give kind of a bird's eye view of where they are on the property and how they're moving. All those things denote intent. And then the eye level cameras, they can be in windows, closer to the ground. They can be on the interior or on the exterior. A lot of them look like they're hidden within specific lighting, like decorative lighting, like sconces and things of that nature. What happens is those cameras give me a face or eye level view of the individual, which potentially helps me identify faces, maybe take pictures, and things that I can use to display to law enforcement with the intent of prosecution, right? Like I'm gonna use this to identify an individual. Maybe they're in a law enforcement database, maybe not. But just for the purpose of demo, like when we talk about cameras, we want multiple levels and multiple layers, right? So cameras facing away from the house, cameras that are also facing the house. They can be trail style cameras where they are put in trees in specific areas of the property line, intended to look back at the house itself. A lot of the modern cameras nowadays, they have like a two-way communication component in tech where I can actually get on a device, whether it's a handheld pad device inside the home or on my phone, whether I'm in the house or out of the house, I can click on a specific camera and talk to an individual. Through that camera, through that microphone, through the speaker, I can have communication with that individual, let them know that they're on camera, let them know, hey, I'm in the shower, I'll give me 10 minutes, right? That may not necessarily be the case. I can just tell them like, hey, we're not home. I wouldn't necessarily do that, depending on the situation, but either way, my ability to communicate with them just makes it another level of difficulty greater, right? Other aspect of deterrence, obviously dogs, right? And again, the dogs don't have to bite. It doesn't have to be a dog. It doesn't have to be dogs plural. It could be a dog. But all the dog does is help on the detection side, and that is going to make noise. IR detection, again, going to make noise when they start tripping those wires. That's what I'm looking at when it comes down to the detection component. Again, that also goes back to, hey, do you have relationships with your neighbors? Do they understand, your pattern of life, if you will? Are they paying attention to the property when they walk by windows? Things of that nature. All right, and we'll talk more about the window stuff in a second. The next component would be what I call deny or denial, right? And within that specific ring or within that specific context, I want to put things in place that give would-be opposition the idea that they are going to be denied access. The reality is, if you give anyone the right tools and the appropriate amount of time to gain access, they can and they will. So the denial is really geared more towards a less committed or less formidable individual. A truly committed and formidable individual is going to be able to get in, like I said, with the right amount of time and the right amount of tools. I just don't want them to be able to do that easily, right? So when we look at things that deny, you see how a lot of these things carry over. The fencing or barriers, right, for a low-level individual without intent and commitment, that may act as a form of denial, right? Seeing the cameras may act as a form of denial, all right? But I'm not going to specifically rely on these things. So when I start thinking about denial, I'm thinking about physical barriers, right? The reality is that's going to translate more into the delay side, but for the purpose of denial and denying access, we're going to put up, maybe you're putting up bars, and they have decorative, right? Like they have decorative wrought iron bars that go on the doors. They have screen doors that go out on the exterior of the actual, or screen or storm doors that go on the outside of the doors. But for bars on doors and windows, I want the doors and windows to appear fortified from the exterior of the home. I want somebody that's outside the home looking in, looking at doors and windows, entry points, and saying, okay, there's bars on those, that's going to take more time. There's storm doors with glass on it, that's going to take more time, right? It's just going to cost them time and energy, again, making a redundancy of tripwires. When we look at this component, we have to also take into consideration that cameras also work as a form of denial, right? If we have, if they walk up to the camera or to the window or door and they see a camera right outside of it or on the inside of it looking out, that can potentially act as a form of denial for an individual that's less committed, like I said. So, things of that nature. Same thing, the dog may potentially act as a form of denial, again, for a less committed individual. Signage doesn't necessarily deny it, but again, it may act as such for an individual. If it deters them from doing it, and in their mind they're denied access, then that's good, right? The reality is that denying access isn't necessarily true, right? We know that an individual with the right training, the right tools, the right time on their side, they can absolutely gain access, okay? So the reality is we realize that for the committed individual, this is just a form of delayance, right? So all these things carry over as a form of delaying their ability to get inside the home quickly without my knowledge, right? The goal is, like, I understand the right individual can get inside the house if I give them enough time, okay? So what I'm doing is creating redundancies that give me time to put specific countermeasures in place for that closest ring, like we mentioned earlier when I drew it on the board. When we talk about delaying, right, now all the bars on the doors and windows, right, whether it's polycarbonate or actual steel bars, screens, storm doors, etc., dogs, signage, all of that acts as potentially a form of delayance. The other things we can start looking at is on windows, right? On windows specifically, they have film, right? And this acts also as a deterrent and potentially as a form of denial, as well as detection if they have to break it. But the reality is when we look at windows, they have tinted film or reflective film. I'm just going to write film for the purpose of this. With that film, all we're trying to do is delay a simple strike to the glass that would cause it to break and give them access to start unlatching window locks or twisting doorknobs. With that film, there's clear film and then there's tinted film, and then there's like a mirror reflective tint on there. And you can pick your option when you secure that, but there's several companies that make it where it's put on the inside of the home, on the inside of the windows, on the inside of the glass portions of the doors, that basically prevent somebody from looking in. That acts again as a form of detection or of deterrence. If I have to walk up to the window, put my hands here to see inside of it against the glass, that makes it more difficult. Tells me that the people inside are obviously paying attention to the aspect of home defense. It makes it more difficult for them to see in case the joint, so to say, see how many people are inside, how that's moving. Obviously the time of day, backlighting all comes into consideration of that. If it's dark outside, pitch black outside, but then you have bright LED lights on the inside of the house, you'll be able to see through those things. But in daylight hours, it does act as a good way to obscure their ability to see inside the structure easily. The other thing it does is it acts as a way of forcing several strikes to the glass, right? It increases the strength and the durability of that glass so that it takes 3, 4, 5, 6 hits to get through it, okay? Which again buys me time, makes a lot of noise, lets neighbors know lets the neighbors know what is going on, as well as letting me know what's going on if I'm inside the home. On the windows, I want to put an audible alarm, right? So that if the glass is shattered or if the window's lifted, there's an audible alarm that happens on the inside as well as the outside of the house. Inside of the house is for me, as well as for the intruders, as well as outside of the house, more or less is for my neighbors. I want that thing to be so loud that my neighbors, when they hear it, because they don't hear it often, when they do hear it, they start looking out their windows and looking at my property. All right, so all those things help on the film side. For doors specifically, I want interior barricades, right? And that could be, there's a myriad of them on the market. I'm not a fan of any one specifically, but something as simple as the idea of putting a 2x4 across the door kind of thing, that helps, right? Like that's going to make breaking into the home, using a ram or a sledgehammer that much, or kicking that much more difficult, right? So some form of a barricade that solidifies the door, barricades the door, fortifies the door, making it harder to gain access into, right? Again, it buys me time, and they're going to have to make a lot of noise. Obviously, audible alarms on both of those, right? So the door alarm comes attached, and the security system is armed. That's making, again, an audible alarm on the inside of the house as well as on the exterior of the house, so that the neighbors know and so that I know, and obviously so the opposition knows. So none of these things are going to necessarily deny access to a formidable individual that's intent on breaking in. However, again, it acts as a form of delayance in that it's one more hoop that they have to jump through in order to actually get inside of the house. De-escalation. It's always harder to spell when you're writing on a whiteboard. That's my story and I'm sticking to it. On the de-escalation side, the reality is that all these things translate and overlap into each other. All of this acts as a form of de-escalation, right? All of these things working together in tandem potentially de-escalate a bad situation from happening. Once they've made, they've closed that gap, if you will, they are closer in space to me, approximately speaking. Things that work towards the form of de-escalation are all of what we've said. Dogs not necessarily just on the outside, but on the inside of the home, right? So a dog, and then communication, right? An alarm that's audible. All these things act as forms of de-escalation for, again, the individual that's not intent on getting in no matter what. The individual that's willing to die for their cause, none of this is going to stop them. It's going to just simply buy me time to put my defensive strategy, when I say defensive, I really mean offensive in nature, my offensive defensive strategy in place as far as having to use force to stop the scenario. So when we think about these things, right, the communication side could be like, hey, I just called 911, 911's on the way. Communication could be like communicating to the individuals that you're armed and will defend yourself with deadly force against them, right? The dog, that can act as a form of de-escalation once making their way inside the house. The reality is, if we're being honest with ourselves, we realize the redundancies of all of these All of this is intended to de-escalate a bad scenario from happening. So the reality is all of these things specifically are tied into working toward affecting their desire to do this thing, right? This home invasion. All of this affects their desire. If they get past all of these individual hoops or tripwires, if you will, we now have an idea as to their intent, right? At that point, like, nothing we do is going to affect their desire, and we now have to switch modes and go into like the defensive aspect of affecting their ability to actually do this thing. And that's what most videos are, like with most lesson plans or most discussions on home defense start at the ability to deliver force to a target, specifically discussing the utilization of deadly force in defense of human life. But like I said before, if we have these discussions prior to, break down these individual components, and really do invest the time, energy, and resources into doing this well, we do a good job of deterring 99% of what's out there, right? And now we're just dealing with that 1%. If they've gotten past all this, that 1% tells us like, hey, like obviously this didn't, this didn't stop or deter their desire. So now we have to deal with their actual ability to do this thing, right? So when it comes down to dealing with their ability to do this and having to use force to solve this problem, right? It's obvious that violence is now the answer to this problem. If that's the case, you need to check local laws. Understand what the local laws dictate is permissible and not permissible. Understand what takes place after that, right? Like understanding it from the perspective of like, hey, if this has to go to court, what would an attorney say, right? Like what's a defense attorney gonna say? What holes do I have in my game? Can I reasonably articulate the necessity for the tactics that I used, the techniques that I used once they entered the home? Can I actually use deadly force in defense of human life in that specific scenario, right? And like, that deserves really, in all honesty, its own discussion. And those are the kind of discussions that we have in greater detail when we deal with those defensive pistol courses, combatives courses, because we're now getting more so into personal security as opposed to physical security. So, hope this helps you out. If you have questions, comments, concerns, feel free to comment below. We'll have a discussion about it. Check us out, AchillesHeelTactical.com. We've got tons of training going on this year. We'd love to see you in class. Take it easy.